But I think ultimately it's a deeply colonial mindset. It's the knee-jerk phenomenon and deeply held belief that, white people in the United States can go and police brown people around the world. There are a number of elections that are questionable around the world. And is that going to be the new norm? The United States can just go into all these countries and abduct the head of state?
What do you fear most about what's to come after all of this?
More nuclear proliferation. I mean, the country that's not being attacked is North Korea, right?
Ever since the Trump administration's abduction of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, we've been seeing some split messaging coming out of the White House. Was this really about, quote, law enforcement, or something else entirely? Power, oil, and maintaining America's dominance in the region? As the Trump White House speaks more openly about asserting US influence in the Western Hemisphere and keeping rivals out, more people are questioning the long-term consequences of this approach and US imperialism in general, not just for Venezuela or Latin America, but the world at large. To talk about all this, my next guest served for years in the Ecuadorian government, eventually becoming the country's foreign minister, a post he held until 2017. Guillaume Long is now a senior fellow at Center for Economic and Policy Research and a top advisor to the Hague Group. So let's get into all that with him. My name is Mohamed Hashem, and this is Real Talk. And he joins us from France, Guillaume Long. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on Real Talk.
No, thank you for having me on. Real pleasure.
Absolutely, sir. I just want to start off. It's been a hell of a week, for lack of a better word, but I want to start off to kind of get your own personal reflections about how you've been looking back at the U.S. abduction of Maduro and everything that's kind of followed. Like, how have you been processing all of this?
I mean, it's obviously very bad news, both from the perspective of international law and trying to prevent this world from becoming a harsher place plagued by war and without much peace. It's also very bad news for Latin America, and it's really will be, I hope, able to talk about that, but it's really the Trump administration to double down on its threats to make the Western Hemisphere its backyard, which is not good news and not welcome for Latin Americans. And I think there's something quite significant which maybe that shocked us, those of us who've been involved in Latin American politics, and those of us who know the region well or who have served in government there, more than it's really reckoned with a broader audience. And that's the fact that it's the first time in history that the US military hits with airstrikes, with military intervention, a South American capital. And so that's a real threshold, and it's quite a traumatic one. It's a taboo that's been sort of broken there. You'd had a lot of attacks, of course. I mean, undoubtedly, you've had covert action. You've had the US intervening in all sorts of ways, supporting coups, supporting brutal military dictatorships during the Cold War. So that was, I'm not saying there was no US intervention in South America, but there's never been an attack on South American territory by the US military. There was once a flotilla post off the shore of Brazil in 1964, actually supporting the 1964 military coup in Brazil, but it never intervened. It never bombed anywhere. And so this time they did. And I think that's quite shocking. And I'm making this distinction between South America and Central America and the Caribbean because clearly the United States has invaded Central American states, Caribbean states that tend to be much smaller countries, with the exception of Mexico. The last significant U.S. military intervention in Latin America was Panama, 1989, 1990. That's 2.5 million inhabitants back then. And Venezuela's 30 million inhabitants. That's larger than Iraq in 2003. So what I'm saying here is, well, I think this is both bad news from the for the United States. I think that's why they didn't commit boots on the ground, and that's why there might be more long-lasting consequences for the US. But it's also, going to your question, shocking for a number of us to see that red line being crossed in terms of bombing a South American capital. That's quite a big deal. In my conversations with diplomats, politicians, people from the region, that's what's been also, as well as the death and the threats and the violations of law, that's also been kind of quite traumatic, I would say.
And you've in a recent article before the abduction of Maduro, you actually ruled out that the U.S. would put boots on the ground.
Yes, and I think I was right in saying that. I think there was no appetite on behalf of a significant portion of the Trump administration to do this. And I think I'd include President Trump himself. There's no question that there was another sector of the Trump administration, I would call it the neocon lobby, led by Marco Rubio and very much centered around sort of South Florida politics, that was pushing, I think, even for boots on the ground. I really think they were pushing for that outcome. But there was no appetite from the more sort of traditional MAGA isolationist sector of the Trump
Right.
administration.
America first.
The America firsters, that's right. But the military buildup was so huge. It was it was the biggest military buildup in contemporary history in the Caribbean, that I think ultimately Trump had to use his toys in one way or another. And when the opportunity arose, he did it hit and run, right? A snatch and grab, or whatever you want to call it. But it's an operation by stealth, quick, out of the country. It's the opposite of boots of the ground, which I would also argue did not lead to regime change. But it's still very spectacular, very brutal.
Right.
And it brought Trump the trophy that he needed in order to be able to get out of this, what could have been a quagmire, I think, and is also not politically popular in the United States, if polls are correct. So I think that's how he got out of this, without boots on the ground and with a relative success in the short term.
And you've mentioned quite a few elements that we will unpack as the conversation goes by. But yes, like you said, you ruled out that there would be boots on the ground in previous, I guess in a previous article before this. But obviously there's been a lot of talk leading up to this action that the U.S. was going to do something in Venezuela. There's been a lot of buildup in the media generally. But let's say you woke up, right, or you saw it on your phone, the news, the headline that the U.S. has done this, that they've gone in, they've taken Maduro and his wife, and they've basically brought them or abducted them to the United States. What was your immediate reaction, Guillaume? Like, do you remember the first thought you had?
I mean, yeah, disbelief. But then, of course, with the Trump administration, one shouldn't, be surprised by anything. It's very unpredictable. It can go in all sorts of directions. Yeah, disbelief, sadness, really sad, because the whole story of Venezuela, we could talk about that, is a tragedy, and to have come to this day where they do this again. First time they bomb a South American city, they abduct the sitting president. It's a long story that goes back to the early 2000s, and I've been following it closely, and I know some of the actors there on the ground as well. I've spent significant amounts of time in my life in Venezuela. And disbelief, sadness, and just think, that the situation could have deteriorated that much. And then maybe also anger, because I think, largely speaking, nobody's innocent here, but largely speaking, the situation has deteriorated because of constant US regime change effort for 25 years. And I'm hearing a lot of pundits saying that there was no regime change efforts until this one. And that's not true, right? I mean, the number of coups that were supported by the United States during those 25 years, 27 years, I suppose, if you're counting from when Chavez was elected in 1998, but particularly starting in 2002, the number of destabilization attempts and campaigns that were led, and that eventually hardened the regime, polarized the situation, made the situation hard on the ground for ordinary Venezuelans, etc., etc. And then this kind of outcome, disbelief, sadness. I thought, to be honest, that they would use the military buildup in another way. I was expecting maybe some hits on non-state targets. So airstrikes that would still violate Venezuelan sovereignty, which again is a violation of international law, but where they wouldn't go against state.
You didn't expect
forces.
It to go this far. Yeah.
Right.
But then, okay, well, how do you respond to what the U.S. was saying? I know that there's split messaging coming from the White House, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the whole idea of quote unquote law enforcement versus going in for the oil and the natural resources. But when U.S. officials come out and say that this was a quote unquote law enforcement operation, right? That this person, Maduro, they see as an illegitimate president who basically stole the last election, and this was their way of bringing him to justice. Again, I'm quoting here. How do you respond to such claims from the U.S. government? You know, if you were in that position.
Yeah, so there's no such thing as law enforcement in a foreign country, right? That's not your job. I mean, I know the United States has still not reckoned to this with this fact historically, but it is a fact. You cannot do law enforcement in a neighboring state. You do law enforcement in your own country. Global law enforcement is called international law, and there are institutions for that, for the enforcement of international law. That's the UN Security Council, and there's something called the UN Charter, and then lots and lots of treaties, pieces of international law, resolutions that come out of that UN Charter, and that are what are supposed to regulate the world system in which we live. And so law enforcement in another country plays well for US domestic audiences, but it is completely unlawful. Article 2 of the UN Charter is very specific about when it is that you can use military force in a foreign country. And it's basically and then Chapter 7 as well of the UN Charter. And basically it's a bit more complicated than that, but there are two broad conditions. One is self-defense, and the United States was not under military attack. And self-defense understood in pretty, straightforward, concrete military terms, right? There's not lots of room for interpretation, right? You're being attacked and you respond. That's the first one. And the second one is, of course, being authorized by the UN Security Council. And none of these conditions apply to the Venezuela case. So it's not law enforcement, it's abduction. And that's what it is. It's abduction, not just of a Venezuelan citizen, but of a sitting head of state. Now, you may question the fact that the elections were legit in 2024. That's a position you can hold. In fact, the think tank that I work for in Washington, D.C., which has been following closely, we follow Latin American elections closely, raised several questions about the electoral outcome of the 2024 elections. I think the 2024 elections in Venezuela were indeed problematic. But, then the 2018 elections in Venezuela were not problematic. So we could go back further. They were actually legit. And the United States called them problematic. And not only did it call them problematic, it didn't recognize the result. And it recognized a parallel self-declared presidency, the presidency of Juan Guaido, who hadn't even run in the elections, right? And then they put him in the seat of Venezuela in various international organizations, which had never happened before, right? If you think about the whole Juan Guaido, this is a bit of a rabbit hole, but I think it's important to explore this. If you think of the whole Juan Guaido adventurism, it's quite remarkable. International law
because they gave him a seat at the UN, if I'm not mistaken, right?
So not at the UN, because the UN wouldn't have it, because the UN is the guardian of international law ultimately,
right?
And international law, and in international law, you don't recognize heads of state that you like and don't recognize the ones that you dislike, right? So authoritarianism doesn't come in play. If it did, we would be in a permanent state of war, and half of the governments wouldn't be in the international system wouldn't be able to have their seat at the United Nations. So in order to avoid that and to create a more peaceful world order, the UN doesn't interfere with those questions, whether the elections were legit or not. The UN recognizes heads of state and governments basically on the basis of control over territory. So it's de facto control over territory and or control over institutions. In both cases, Maduro controlled both the Venezuelan territory and Venezuelan institutions. Loads of countries that recognized Guaido recognized him in name, but then when they were dealing with security issues or where they were repatriating migrants, they were calling the Maduro government, right? So anyway, but the United States still recognized this Guaido government, and they didn't put him in the UN, but they put him in the Organization of American States, which is incredible if you think about it. Never has the United States gone that far. It's not like when Pinochet did a coup in '73, the US recognized the democratic opposition or the leftovers of the Allende government, or even take the Cuban example. It's not like there was a government that were recognized by the United States in Miami after the Cuban Revolution. That didn't happen. So this was a real taboo. And of course, the United States hadn't recognized the Venezuelan elections for a number of electoral cycles. And so they didn't recognize these either in 2024, And those, I think, were problematic. But it made no difference because they hadn't recognized the previous ones, you know? So anyway, you get into this vicious cycle.
I'm wondering if you personally think that Gaza, the Gaza genocide and the lawlessness or the failure to apply international law around it has set a precedent and is allowing for actions like what we just saw in Venezuela with Maduro, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Gaza is the big precedent. I mean, I think this new Venezuela one is going to be the big precedent for the Western Hemisphere, and it's a wake up call for the Western Hemisphere. But for the world, Gaza is the big precedent, right? There's no absence of legal clarity. We're talking about international law. There's no absence of legal clarity in the case of Palestine, right? You have a long history of resolutions that order self-determination for the Palestinian people, the end of occupation, the end of settler colonialism. And I mean, you could argue that these have been violated systematically. So it's not just the post-October 7, and not just the post-October 7 phenomenon, but it's particularly egregious after October 7, particularly given, the ICJ's advisory opinion of July 2024, and then the very, I would say, seminal UN General Assembly resolution of September 2024 that are very hard and very clear and unambiguous about what Israel should do, of course, but also what third states should do. They give third states obligations that they have to comply to in international law. And unfortunately, even the states that voted for these obligations, that self-imposed these obligations, are not complying with these and not fulfilling their obligations. And of course, in the context of not just apartheid and occupation, but in the context of genocide, which is an even graver crime, right? And ethnic cleansing. So I think, yes, I mean, in a nutshell, Gaza is the real symbolic, historic in the bad sense of the word, moment for a radical demise of international rules of the game, international law, in a context where international law was already being weakened. And it's also a signal from the United States that it's not going to yield, that it's going to double down,
Yeah, I'm curious to know how you would have reacted if you were still holding your post as foreign minister in the Ecuadorian government. I know that there's key disagreements between you and the current government, but if let's just say you were in government when the Maduro abduction took place, what do you think you would have done? What do you think the first crucial steps you would have taken?
Yeah, I mean, I think we would have been absolutely firm in our response and in denouncing the attack and in defending sovereignty. I mean, it is what we did for 10 years. There are a number of examples of that. We actually got rid of the largest U.S. military base in Latin America back then, which was on our territory. We weren't lukewarm with aspects of sovereignty and respect for international law. You might recall we gave Julian Assange asylum in our embassy and other things that were quite bold and daring in the international system.
You were criticized for how you dealt with Venezuela at some point.
Yeah, for sure. We were criticized for defending Venezuelan sovereignty and for not supporting, I mean, the real regime change efforts happened after we were not in office anymore. So 2018, 2019, which was the Guaido experiment, and 2019, 2020. So in 2019, there were several coup attempts supported by the US, one big one in April. So we weren't there anymore. But we would have denounced those coups for sure. I mean, we supported negotiations inside Venezuela, and there were a number of voices that supported negotiations to lower the tensions so that, meaningful elections could be held without the threats of sanctions. I personally think the sanctions really soured the whole situation in Venezuela and are often overlooked by pundits, by politicians, by the international community. I think it's the sanctions that really hardened the Venezuelan government, hardened the military control inside Venezuela. It's the sanctions that caused a massive migratory crisis of 7 to 8 million people leaving Venezuela. I mean, Venezuela went from exported 2 million barrels of oil per day to 300,000 barrels of oil. That's 95% of its exports gone overnight. And so, yeah, it became, extremely hardened regime. Quite, with a hard, with on top of that, regime change attempts, coup attempts. So obviously, that really tightened the security apparatus and soured the context, including the democratic context, and which is a real shame. So our job as a government, and not as the Venezuelan opposition, was to denounce those attempts to destabilize Venezuela for sure. I think that was and I think we would have done that. Now, we would have also facilitated conversations, discussions. There were a number of attempts back then with former presidents of Panama, of Colombia, of Spain intervening, but that were systematically sabotaged by the United States because the United States did not want a deal, a pacted transition. It wanted regime change. I mean, during the first Trump administration, Rubio was not Secretary of State, but he was, senator, and he was pushing for regime change in Venezuela because he sees regime change in Venezuela as paramount to regime change in Cuba. So I think we would have pushed back against that. Yeah.
How would you have basically denounced how European governments have reacted to what happened to Maduro? Because as I'm sure you know, they've been a lot of leaders, including Keir Starmer here in the UK, who basically struggled to answer yes or no questions about the legality of such an act and what happened to Maduro, and more so trying to focus, him and other governments in Europe, more so trying to focus on the idea of ushering in democracy, or the importance of ushering in democracy to Venezuela, making it clear that they never liked Maduro, but it's important to, usher in democracy and focus on that. How would you, or actually not even how would you, how do you see the situation in Europe in terms of their reaction?
Yeah, I think it's really very sad. Politically and even morally questionable, but also it's a strategic blunder, I think, on behalf of the European Union.
Do you think so?
European states, yeah, not to have condemned this more forcefully. I mean, they're basically saying we are monitoring the situation. Three paragraphs on how awful Maduro was, one paragraph calling on the respect for international law when international law has already been violated, so you should have condemned it. And saying we're monitoring the situation. So, what's the global South? I mean, this is the typical double standards that the global South is now, really fed up with. Essentially, what's going to happen when the US moves on Greenland? I mean, Europe shouldn't be surprised if the rest of the world say, "Oh, we're monitoring the situation." So it is a strategic blunder.
It's actually a very important point, Guillaume. Just the whole idea of how, if let's say Trump moves on Greenland and tries to take it, and then the global South issues statements, like you said, where it's like, oh, we're monitoring the situation in Greenland. That is a very interesting point you make.
Which is the equivalent, and I mean, the European Union didn't have to say they love Maduro. Okay, fine, I wasn't expecting them to do so. But if questionable elections or governments you don't like become the basis for abducting heads of state, violating sovereignty and abducting heads of state, then where's the limit? I mean, there are a number of elections that are questionable around the world, and is that going to be the new norm? The United States can just go into all these countries and abduct the head of state? That's not something the European Union should stand for. And they're dealing with
or other actors for that matter, other actors across the world. Yeah.
That's not how it works. So I think for the European Union, it was a huge mistake. I actually think Trump values force and probably values people standing up to him more than he values people being very subservient to him. I'm not saying you should provoke him, because that can also backfire, and we've seen it. But I mean, being respectfully forceful, and particularly as European Union, unlike other regions of the world, has muscle and has collective action. In fact, if there's one example where collective action can kind of work. It's not perfect by far, but it's the European Union. The global South often has no such function in regionalism or collective action. Non-aligned movement is not doing great. The G77 is not doing great. Lots of regional bodies of the global South are not doing great. But the European Union has much more leeway in the international system. They could have responded much more forcefully, sending a signal to the Trump administration, this is unacceptable. Sending a signal to other countries in the world that they could also be bolder. These are virtuous cycles. The international politics is a really good example. I mean, you can use other metaphors, but the snowball effect, right? When one stands tall, the other ones are more emboldened to stand tall. And if it's the European Union, then that's going to have a trickle-down effect that's not negligible. And I think there was a responsibility there, which is perhaps a political and a moral responsibility. But there was also an interest to be defended, which is the strategic point I'm making. And I think the European Union is reading Trump badly. They did it in the first Trump administration. They thought, oh, we'll duck for 4 years, and then the US will be its old usual self again. And when Biden came back, the US said some nice things, but it wasn't really its old usual self. A lot of the things that were done by Trump, certainly in the Western Hemisphere, were not undone by the Biden administration. And so now what are they doing? They're ducking again with this new Trump administration. And I think that's a big mistake, because I don't think the United States is ever going to be the same.
And how do you react to the media, mainstream media, let's say, to the way they've been covering this? I mean, we've been seeing a lot of amplified voices that have basically called for the invasion of Venezuela. We obviously know that Maduro has his own base and he has supporters, but I do think what's been missing, and I'm curious to see what you think, but what's been missing in terms of media coverage is that we haven't really been hearing a lot from Venezuelans who are against the Maduro government and are against what Maduro has done to the country, but also are against U.S. intervention or foreign intervention for that matter. And I'm curious to see how you've been looking at media coverage of this. I mean, U.S. media coverage, but just mainstream media coverage in general.
Yeah, I'm disappointed. I mean, I'm not necessarily that surprised, but I'm disappointed, that the media hasn't learned the lessons of the past. I mean, most U.S. adventurism in the global South, for need of a better word, has been disastrous in the last few decades. The best example, the most resorted to example, is, of course, the Iraq War, which created a massive, historic political crisis in the Middle East, which is still ongoing, destabilizing the whole region at huge cost for peoples around the world, first and foremost in the Middle East, of course, but you could argue around the world, massively backfiring. And, the media first accompanied it, kind of supported it, despite all the lies that were exposed. And then by the second Bush administration, there was more mainstream media pushback, which then accompanied the early years of the Obama administration, that kind of fed off that pushback and very much represented a turn away from the abuses of the war on terror and U.S. unilateralism during the Iraq War and so on. And the first Obama years really represented that new kind of liberal consensus in the world. And here we are, 15 years later. If the Obama, if we use the Obama election, a bit more than that, it's 17 years later, whatever. If we use the Obama election as that moment of new media and liberal support for international law, if you like, or for a less chaotic world order.
Oh, that's out the door now.
and the media is completely, forgotten those lessons and is resorting to the same deeply ideological knee-jerk reactions. Oh, there's a bad dictator. Yes, I mean, the United States shouldn't have really done it like that, but ultimately, maybe it's a good thing, right? And no, this is going to have deep, far-reaching consequences for the world, because Trump is now emboldened and thinking he can use his military successfully all over the place and do all these hits and run. No, he doesn't want boots on the ground because he made he made promises to his MAGA base in the 2024 elections, and he knows this is costly, so that maybe is a lesson that he's learned from the war on terror. But he does love these strikes, whether it's against Soleimani in Iran or against the Iranian nuclear complex, or whether it's against Maduro, and we're going to see more of these. And this is not good for the planet. And the media is kind of ultimately, there's some pushback because it's Trump and they don't love him. But it's more against Trump than against the concept of this, right? And I'm going to use a word that maybe, I don't know, not everybody loves, but I think ultimately it's a deeply colonial mindset. It's the knee-jerk phenomenon and deeply held belief that, white people in the United States can go and police brown people around the world because that's been done for the last few centuries, and it's an ongoing, deeply held belief, right, that the United States and its allies can police the world, and by policing the world, they make things worse. In fact, and I would say, in the long run, will make things worse for them. Latin Americans value their sovereignty; they're not going to forget this. You may have a series of government they're not even a majority, but that are pro-Trump right now. But, let's not forget that the pink tide was the result of US unilateralism in the 1990s and early 2000s. And that, potential for a new wave of sort of collective sovereignty or search for collective dignity is not, not off the cards in the coming years. Yeah.
At the beginning of our conversation, I was mentioning the split messaging coming out of the White House in terms of like law enforcement, quote unquote, versus what Trump was saying. But I'm curious here. So when Trump comes out and says, no, this is very much about oil. This is very much about natural resources. This is what we want to take. We want to bring in American companies to do the shelling, all of this stuff. Some people would say that they appreciate the bluntness of what Trump is doing versus when they juxtapose it with how the U.S. has, previous U.S. governments have spoken before about, again, ushering in democracy in countries like Iraq or Libya or Afghanistan. What do you make of it when you hear the Trump's bluntness about what he's actually wanting to do on the ground?
That's a double-edged sword. So it's both useful for all sorts of people, pundits and analysts. I suppose people like me and others would have normally said, for previous U.S. interventions, no, it's not about democratization. No, it's not about state building. It's not about nation building. Ultimately, it's about geopolitics. It's about power. It's about great power rivalry. And it's about natural resources as well, and control over resources and so on and so forth. And this is just the sort of the democratization argument is just a sort of liberal veneer that gives soft power to what is essentially hard power rationale, right? So that's useful. I think it's good that the mask is off, and I think it's useful for people to see, because I think that's fundamentally what it's always been about. It's not really been about doing good things for other countries that the United States doesn't really care about, right? It's about the US's own interests, not about the interests of other states. So that's a good thing that the mask is off on that front. But on the other hand, I think it's terrible that this message could be normalized, right? That ultimately, I suppose there is a certain element of hypocrisy in diplomacy, right? And to live in a world where we have to justify ourselves and to live in a world where we have to give moral arguments is also important, because if there are no moral arguments and there is no ethics in international politics anymore, and it's all like, oh, it's fine, might makes right, and that's fine, and it's absolutely normal, and it's always been like that, when actually, we've been spending a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of agency to try and create institutions, to create a more peaceful world order. And this kind of blatant, brazen return, or and glorification of it's not even World War II, it's a pre-World War I order, is, I think, it's very dangerous and a slippery slope to all sorts of hyper-realist rationales that I think are very harmful for humanity.
Yeah. Another person where the Maduro abduction has been regarded as a win for is Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State in the U.S. there's been a lot of focus right now about I guess, the ideology that's driving him in terms of how he sees Latin American governments that he doesn't like. And there is also there's an identity aspect that's related to his heritage, Cuban. But there has been an obsession, or what has been called an obsession in the media, of how Rubio sees the governments of Venezuela, sees the governments of Cuba, sees, Nicaragua as well, and it's ideology that's driving it. But how do you see Rubio's role, which is very much looking like he's in the driver's seat right now when it comes to U.S. policy towards Latin America?
Yeah, right now he's certainly looking like he's very happy with the outcome. I mean, to the extent to which he's completely happy with the outcome, not sure, because he does want regime change, and I don't think he's achieved regime change.
Mm.
But this is still, by and large, I'd say, the policy that he's been pushing for. And again, since the first Trump administration, when he was senator, not yet Secretary of State, but we know that he was, very influential in pushing for regime change in Venezuela back then. He was key in pushing for Trump's first tranche of sanctions in 2017, then the oil sanctions in 2019. He was key in pushing the Guaido parallel presidency. He really was the leading Republican on that front. And I think he would like to see. I think his greatest aspirations as Secretary of State is to do regime change in Cuba. I think that's the legacy he's seeking, and he sees Venezuela and Cuba as deeply intertwined.
But
And
what's feeding that, Guillaume? Do you believe? What's feeding that ideology?
I mean, it comes from South Florida.
Right.
That's the Republican Party he comes from. That's the
Yep.
milieu he comes from. It's the politics he comes from. It's also the family background he comes from. It's a
Yes.
deeply held belief. It's deeply ideological. He's a much more ideological person than Trump is. He's much more marked by the neoconservative hatred of communism that emerges of the Reagan years and the Cold War than Trump is, right? I think he's successfully adapted to sort of to America first, and I think the area where there's most overlap between America firsters and neocons in the Trump administration is Latin America, it's the Western Hemisphere, because for Rubio it's more of a Cold War, anti-revolutionary, anti-Cuba, anti-communism thing. For Trump, I think there's even a nostalgia for early US empire, right? Spheres of influence. So it's like those years. I mean, in the case of Greenland, you can even go back to the 19th century, right? When the US was consolidating its landmass and acquiring things like, Hawaii and Alaska, right? That's the second half of the 19th century. But in terms of the more traditional imperialism, the Venezuela style stuff, it's more the first few decades of gunboat diplomacy. So it's the years from McKinley to FDR. FDR changed that policy to the good neighbor policy, but it's really Theodore Roosevelt, right? So it's the Roosevelt corollary and now the Monroe corollary to the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. It's gunboat diplomacy. It's what the U.S. did in the 1910s and the 1920s by invading all these countries in the Circum-Caribbean. So it's kind of a nostalgia for that make America great bit again bit, which has to do with those early years where the United States was both imperialistic and isolationist, right? It was
Yeah.
imperialistic in the Western Hemisphere, but isolationist in terms of Europe, obviously. So there's an overlap between I would even say Vance and Rubio, right? Where the Western Hemisphere. I'm not sure Vance was in favor of the Venezuela attack. I don't know that, but
I'm
uh,
not sure if he held a position, to be honest.
yeah, maybe not. But we've seen the MAGA base now 80% of it, according to polls, supporting the Venezuela thing, the Venezuela attack. Whereas originally there was. I mean, we know that the MAGA base has been kind of important in this "No More Forever War" message of the second Trump administration. That seems to be negotiable and in the Western Hemisphere. There's an area there where new wars is kind of forgiven for the MAGA base, and that's the Western Hemisphere. And I think Rubio's been able to to live with that, to live with uh, you know moving away from his position, his apparently deeply held positions on Ukraine, his erstwhile held positions on Ukraine on the one hand, and on the other hand, be more assertive in the Western Hemisphere. I think Rubio's adapted to that reality. He's become less of a hawk outside of the Western Hemisphere, and because he was always more hawkish on Western Hemisphere issues. It's fine. It's fine by him, and it fits with his ideology.
So what happens now? I mean, Trump, as we saw in his speech, he threw the opposition. He threw Maria Machado under the bus, saying that she's basically not fit for leadership, or he doesn't see her to be fit for leadership. So there goes the opposition. The person in charge right now is Maduro's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez. The regime is very much in charge of the country. So is this a situation where, like you said earlier, the art of the deal, where Trump just strikes a deal with the current government in place, and they get the access to the oil and the natural resources that they want? They basically are able to build a pathway for the American companies to go in, and then that's it. Is that the end of that?
So a number of things. I think, firstly, regime change was not successful. It's one thing to do one of those, spectacular Delta team jobs of abducting a president, which is hit and run or snatch and grab or whatever. And for sure, they got some support on the inside. They've already said that the CIA had some people on their payroll giving them Maduro's location and describing how what the bunker looked like so that they could replicate it in Kentucky and practice and all this. Okay, that's spectacular, and the US knows how to do that. But it's very different to do that than have the support of large sectors of the military command, and to do a coup and then bring in the anti-Chavista opposition. That would have required boots on the ground. That's what I've been arguing for months. So I don't think they've done regime change. And I think Trump had no appetite for boots on the ground that was required for regime change. And so that's what now he's trying, the trophy is Maduro. I don't particularly really believe in the sort of grand scale political betrayal on behalf of the Chavista regime of Maduro. I don't think Delcy Rodriguez is in on it. I mean, history will prove me right or wrong. I don't believe these people are. I think that these people are deeply ideological. And so now what they're dealing with is their preferences, which are, I think, Chavista preferences, and constraints, which are the constraints of awesome US military power off their coast, and significantly the oil blockade. This is very important. The oil blockade is something we don't talk about enough in the media. Venezuela has been unable to export any oil at all since the oil blockade was put in place, and it's now been in place for a number of weeks. Venezuela cannot survive without some export of oil. It's 95% of its exports, and a number of people are already raising the issue of potential starvation if the oil blockade goes on for several more weeks. So there is certainly leverage on behalf of the United States through the sanctions, but even more importantly, in the short term, sanctions have been in place for a while now, but even more importantly, in the short term, with the oil blockade. So if we see the Venezuelan government sort of adapt to the new circumstances and yield to a number of US demands, I think it's primarily because of that. Now, having said that, the whole oil rationale and the whole oil promises of the Trump administration, I don't really believe in that much. I don't think there's that much appetite on behalf of the oil majors to go into Venezuela right now. Oil prices are not really high enough. $60 a barrel West Texas is not really high enough to justify the huge investments that are required right now to get the Venezuelan oil industry running at significant scale for the US's benefit. And again, because there's been no regime change, I mean, I'm sure some oil majors are thinking of their relationship with the current Rodriguez government and what that means, etc., etc. So there are a number of variables at hand here, which I think we need to take into consideration. And then one thing on the opposition, yeah, I mean, the US has misread Venezuela for so many years now, and they've always systematically sided with the most radical part of the opposition, the most regime change part of the opposition. And any opposition, and some of it quite staunch opposition to Maduro and to Chavez, in fact, that was willing for some kind of negotiated outcome was sort of considered as not the proper opposition by the United States. And that's a crucial mistake. There are a number of people in the Venezuelan opposition, including former US darlings, people like Capriles, who were supported by the United States when they opposed Chavez 20 years ago, who have been against the sanctions because they're starving Venezuelans, and radicalizing the government, the Maduro government, who have been against strikes because they're going to hurt Venezuelans and polarize things even more, and I think have been proven right in the sense that we're not seeing through this kind of support for the most radical actors any kind of negotiated outcome, which I think is ultimately necessary if the United States wants a post-Chavista order, right? So yeah, I think once again, no regime change, and I'm not surprised that Trump threw Maria Corina Machado under the bus, because there's no real possibility of her being in the country given the current constellation of power and a military that's deeply hostile to her, and Chavistas that are really worried that if that kind of opposition comes to power, they will then all be purged and persecuted and maybe killed. And, so it's again a misreading of the Venezuelan reality, which is why a number of voices have been calling for a negotiated outcome rather than an imposition of a regime change along those lines.
There's a widespread belief or perception that Maduro will be convicted in his trial in the United States. But what about the other possibility? I mean, what happens if this trial doesn't go as to the way the White House wants it to go? What if Maduro gets acquitted? What happens then? I mean, do you think that these calculations are in place?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so far from what I'm seeing, I wouldn't completely discard the possibility that Maduro is acquitted, right? I mean, firstly, it's really important to say that the whole narcotics rationale is being trashed by the expert community. Venezuela is not an exporter of fentanyl, we all know that, and it's not even a significant exporter of cocaine to the United States. Colombian cocaine is still the largest.
It's like 400 tons, I believe, or something.
Yeah, but Colombian cocaine, cocaine is not being produced in Venezuela. So the question is whether it's transiting via Venezuela or not. And then the second question is whether it was transiting via Venezuela with the support of the Venezuelan government, right? And then going even further with the support of Maduro, because this is a court case not against his government, but against Maduro. So, we know that it's marginal what was going via Venezuela. Most of the cocaine has been going southwards from Colombia, and has been exiting the South American landmass via the Pacific coast. Venezuela is not on the Pacific coast; it's on the Caribbean. So, Colombian cocaine has been trafficked and has been transiting via Ecuador and Peru. Literally like 70 to 80% of it. Figures differ, but via Venezuela, it's like 5 to 8%. It's absolutely marginal. And the expert community agrees on this. And I think this is why basically the United States has just downgraded the much talked about cartel of the suns, El Cartel de los Soles, to now a political culture. Because I think they thought that in the court case, the expert community that was going to come and was going to have to testify was going to trash this. That there's no cartel of the suns. It doesn't exist. It's incredible. It's actually an old appellation that goes back to the early 90s with probably the connivance of the CIA and two Venezuelan officers trafficking cocaine back then, long before Chavez was even elected. And because they had suns on their uniforms, the DEA called it the Cartel of the Suns, and it was only two officers. And so this is a complete fabrication. And because it's a fabrication, now the DOJ, the Department of Justice, the Trump administration, has downgraded it. They downgraded it on the same day that they captured Maduro, which is not a coincidence, because they obviously said this is not going to hold in court. So if that is not going to hold in court, and given how, sort of outlandish and unpredictable the Trump administration can be, and the DOJ, all the crazy things the DOJ can say. I mean, we haven't seen any of the evidence yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's very little evidence against Maduro. I mean, we know of a cocaine shipment that was detained in Mexico. It didn't even make it to the US.
There's something related to machine guns as well.
I mean, machine guns, is this a joke? Are you going to, indict a president for holding a machine gun in a foreign country where they have their own gun laws? And, and machine guns, they're all coming from the US under the Trump administration, which is in favor of gun ownership. I mean, the whole thing is, completely bizarre. So I don't know. I mean, if I would venture, again, I haven't seen the evidence, but I would venture that if US judiciary is still independent, and depending on who the judge is, and there are all sorts of variables at hand, the current judge, some quarters are trying to get rid of because, of course, he's 92 years old. So there's a whole, I think, discussion on whether it should be this judge or whether he should be replaced by someone else. I don't know whether there are political motivations here going either way. I don't know enough about this. But I know this is, obviously this is a significant court case from the perspective of the DOJ. But if the US judiciary is independent, there are a number of reasons why they could be, why I think the trial could not go forward. Not least because it's a court case against a sitting head of state, if they go by international law, that was abducted, right? So the court could declare itself not competent. But then even if the court does declare itself competent, which I think would be unlawful, as I've argued here, then, what is the evidence that is going to be presented, and where do we go from here? Given how crazy the DOJ has been over the last few months, I wouldn't be surprised if this whole thing was ditched. And then where do we go? I mean, politically, geopolitically. So a long way to go here. I imagine the Trump administration is going to try and delay this court case. Certainly nothing significant for the next 2 years, I don't think, as long as they can, right? We're not going to see a quick result here. But again, one last thing on that. It's so ironic when you see, the same month that they attack Maduro, the Trump administration, Trump himself, pardoning Juan Orlando Hernandez.
Yes, the former president of Honduras.
Yeah, it's incredible. One of the found guilty by a jury, no less, of participating in the trafficking of 400 tons of cocaine, one of the largest convictions in recent history for a drug trafficker. It's quite surreal, really, if you think about it.
But, just about the former Honduras president is that I think people have argued just the last week or so that this happened. This is why people are saying that the Venezuela issue is looked at through the prism of right wing versus left wing, is that they saw that this, this former president was actually more on the right, which appealed more to Trump, and therefore a pardon was underway. But I do have one more question to ask.
I think he did appeal to Rubio.
To Rubio.
But then I saw an interview with Rubio the other day, sort of almost throwing the president under the bus. Said, I had nothing to do with this decision. Don't blame me. It was the presidential prerogative to give pardons. So I sense some tensions inside the administration there on that issue. I mean, I really don't know how the whole thing unfolded. It was clearly also Stone, right? Roger Stone was involved with this decision. And he probably lobbied Trump heavily. So who knows what happened there. But, he was certainly close to Rubio and the neocons in Miami, that President Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was trafficking drugs, yeah.
My last question for you, Guillaume, is more on the personal front. I mean, what scares you? What do you fear most about what's to come after all of this?
I mean, generally speaking, in more abstract terms, a world order with more war, with more nuclear proliferation. I think might makes right is enough said. Right? I fear that. I'm against nuclear proliferation. Don't misinterpret my words. But I think that if that's the road we're going down, then that's something I certainly fear. And we often talk about the threats of climate change for our species, but I think we don't talk enough about the nuclear threat in that kind of world order for the survival of our species. I think it's a real thing. It's a cliche, but it's a real thing. And I really think we should be having that conversation more. on the one hand, but that's more abstract. And in the shorter term, and for my region, for Latin America, I really fear that there's an attack on Cuba. Cuba is a country which is much tighter even than Venezuela was in terms of its security apparatus. It's been resisting for decades. I don't think that snatch and grab or hit and run strategy would work that easily in Cuba. I think they've been very prepared for decades. But I think the United States, ultimately, it's not about success, as we've seen in terms of regime change. It's also about the capacity to hurt and to inflict pain on populations through sanctions, through economic warfare, which is what they're doing on Cuba right now. And if they starve Cuba of oil, or if there's a de facto naval blockade on Cuba, then a lot of people are going to suffer. And that's what I feel the most, the suffering of people in Latin America, the suffering of people in Cuba. Um, and they're already suffering because of the tightening of sanctions now, with the reintroduction of Cuba on the state sponsor of terrorism list, which is ridiculous. Cuba's not a state sponsor of terrorism, but it is on the list so that that label can apply to Cuba, which means draconian sanctions. And also the United States having President Trump is not waiving Title III of the Helms-Burton Law, which is too complicated to explain here, but means essentially that it's an extraterritorial application of the embargo, which means that a lot of would-be investors from Europe and elsewhere do not do business in Cuba because they're worried of being taken to court in the United States, essentially. And so it's a real strangulation of Cuba, which is stupid because it's going to cause an even greater migratory exodus from Cuba to the United States, which is what the MAGA base doesn't want. And it could destabilize Cuba in a way that would resemble Haiti, which is not good for the region, not good for narco trafficking, by the way, because one thing we can say about Cuba is there's no drugs going via Cuba to the United States. That's one area where, there are no drugs. You can read any DEA report you want. It's not going via Cuba, right? In fact, the DEA wasn't even mentioned in Venezuela, but that wasn't a hindrance. So I fear that. I fear, an attack on Cuba. If it's not an attack, strengthening an economic warfare, but also the potential for an attack.
And we're going to leave it here. You know, the best interviews always take place before lunch. So thank you for taking the time, Guillaume Long. Thank you for coming on Real Talk. I really appreciate your time.
No, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the interview. Thanks.
Thank you, Guillaume. Thank you.